Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. And I'm hoping with me is Louie. Are you there?
I am here.
Are you there, Mother? You can hear me?
I can hear you, Father.
Nice to join you today. And I believe we have a very special guest.
We do indeed. In fact, we've been trailing this guest for some time now because every time we talk about nihilism, we say our nihilist. So I'd like to introduce our nihilist, finally. John Marmish. Marmish, is that right, John?
Marmish as the
Amish, yeah. Who is, well, shall I let you introduce yourself, John? Is that okay?
I'm John Marmish. It's great to be talking with you guys.
Brilliant. Now, John, you've written a couple of books because I found you, discovered you with your book. Let's have a look. Laughing at Nothing, Humor as a Response to Nihilism. And that's what I first found you. But you also blog at The Nihilist Void, which has lots of your writing on. So I guess we're going to jump straight into it, Matthew. I'm going to ask you, this is the question that I want to ask you then, John. I don't believe that the universe has any meaning. And I describe myself as a nihilist. So am I wrong? Is that a wrong description of myself?
Well, in my view, there's a very particular meaning of nihilism I have in mind, because I think of nihilism as being associated with a kind of distress over the meaninglessness of the universe. I go along with Simone de Beauvoir's definition of nihilists as frustrated idealists. So if you have a kind of frustration over the meaninglessness of the universe, if you experience a kind of longing for meaning at the same time that you think there is no meaning, then I would classify you as a nihilist.
So that's an interesting question, because I did used to have a website, I Hate the Universe, and it, and it had a picture of a finger sticking up, but basically the universe. I'm not entirely convinced, though, that this is a reaction to me aspiring to meaning, though. That's the thing. I think more I see a lack of it and then decide, therefore, there isn't any. So this is where my questioning about whether I am a nihilist or not comes from. But sorry, Matthew, what were you going to say?
Well, I want to echo that question. And so in your suggested definition there was this idea of a distress over it. So it's not just seeing the universe as meaningless, it's having some kind of distress over that.
I think so. I mean, if without the distress, without the desire for something to be different than it is, it seems like a person is perfectly reconciled to the universe, and they're more like I don't know, maybe a stoic or a cynic or maybe a postmodernist who doesn't have any negative or positive feelings about the universe. And to me, that doesn't seem to jive with what nihilism, it doesn't seem what nihilism is to me. I mean, the nihilist thinkers that I've been inspired by, they all think that objective meaning is an illusion or something that's created by individual human minds rather than something that's ready-made. But what seems to be the common thread running throughout them is this wish or this desire that there was something that you could sort of grasp onto objectively. So it's in that gap between the aspiration and the reality that I think nihilism lies. And I think there's all kinds of different sorts of nihilism that are, nicely explained this way. So like epistemological nihilism might be the type of nihilism that occurs when one wishes that there was truth but realizes that there is no objective truth, or moral nihilism, when they wish that there was an objective good but realize there is no objective good. So that's what I see how the nihilist operates in that gap between the ideal and the reality that they find themselves living in. And so, it's a good way, I think, of distinguishing nihilism from other related types of philosophies that also might deny objective meaning or the meaning of the universe.
So Louis, given that, then, does that sound that you would still want to describe yourself as a nihilist? Then, do you have some distress over this? Would you wish it be other than it is?
I mean, I definitely have distress about the state of the universe. Again, I see where I think I kind of fall flat a little bit is the aspiration for perfection or things to be different. I mean, I definitely think, I frequently make the joke that if there were a God, A, I wouldn't be on his fucking side, and B, I'd be on the team to go and fucking punch him in the face, because, if any of this was his idea, I'm not on that team.
Yeah, but
I guess,
so the world is not exactly the way that you would want it, even in that case.
so I guess that would make me a nihilist then. So I think I can probably stick with my definition of I am a nihilist. And about you.
Yeah, you sound
sorry.
like me, and even even in the case with God, I think that's an interesting example, because a lot of people would find the idea that there's something like a religious type of nihilism might seem oxymoronic to certain people, but I think it makes perfect sense that you could be a religious nihilist if you believe in you long for the existence of God, but feel fallen from that God. So there's a separation between the ideal and the real.
And just to clarify, I don't believe there's a God. Just if there were, I'd want to beat him up. So John, are you a nihilist then? I mean,
I consider myself a nihilist, and in the sense that that I've been articulating. So I've constantly, I mean, throughout my life since I was a teenager, struggled with this feeling like the world was substandard, and so. My type of nihilism, I think, is the type of nihilism which struggles to recognize the source of that type of dissatisfaction, why it is I feel the world is substandard, at the same time as ironically trying to embrace that distress and do something, I guess you could say, positive with it, constructive.
And I guess that takes us to the book then. Is it Laughing at Nothing? So does that give a sense of why you've written and taken that approach in terms of saying, okay, given this, rather than feel distressed by it or deal with my distress in a way which is laughing at this, seeing it as genuinely absurd, so it's something we can only laugh at?
Right, and with humor, and one of the the root causes of humor, I think, is incongruity. It's like a response to different types of incongruity. So like in jokes or in slapstick comedy, there's a sort of incongruous friction between various elements. And if nihilism is a type of incongruity, in the book I call it nihilistic incongruity, which is that misfit between the ideal and the real, then humor seems like an appropriate response to nihilism as a type of incongruity. And that's kind of the point of that book, is that despite what traditionally has been seen as a situation in nihilism that should be overcome, or that needs to be fought against endlessly, or needs to be eradicated, that we can face it with a humorous attitude, which is a type of attitude that sits with incongruity, lingers with it, and demands pleasure from it. So at the same time that it's a distressing misfit, or a view of the world as substandard, nihilism can also, we can extract a type of pleasure in lingering with it and contemplating it. So yeah, the humorous response is, I think, a very appropriate and powerful response to nihilistic incongruity.
And I mean, both Matthew and I know we love a good laugh, don't we, Matthew? And I mean,
we do indeed, Louie. We do indeed.
And I mean, I feel even in the darkest moments, humor can be very important and useful. And the only thing I had when I was reading that book, I had a line from the Smiths kept entering my mind. That joke isn't funny anymore. And I wonder if there's a point when, because I very much agree with the idea. I mean, I often tell people, you don't want to be the butt of the universe's joke. You want to laugh back at the universe. But on the other hand, is there a point when that joke isn't funny anymore?
Yeah, well, I think that's another aspect of humor is, there's a theory called the superiority theory of humor, which claims that we laugh down at things. So things that are small or insignificant to us are the things that we laugh at. That's why it feels awful to be laughed at, because you feel like you're being made insignificant. And so, yeah, I think that there are jokes that are not funny if you're the butt of the jokes, as you're saying. But one of the powers that I think humor has is that it can make one feel greater than the thing that you're laughing at. So the problem with nihilism, like I was saying earlier, is that we wish the universe to be different from the way it is. It's the universe is defective. There's a problem with it. But with humor, you can psychologically sort of do a perspectival flip and see yourself above that. So you can make the incongruity smaller than you. You can make it not a dangerous incongruity and thus laugh at it. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are points when all of us feel like we're being threatened by the meaninglessness of the universe, and so the joke is not funny in those cases, but the attempt to use humor to flip things around, I think that's the promise of using a humorous attitude.
And I completely agree with all that. And then the word in that that I was drawn to, that I found myself pondering over, is this idea of defective. So it has this idea that the universe is defective by virtue of it having no meaning.
I would definitely insist upon that, from at least from my way of viewing the universe. We live in a universe where animals have to tear one another apart in order to survive. Suffering is a part of the universe. Terrible, awful things are constantly happening. That's not to say that only bad things happen, but I think the universe is pretty awful a lot of times.
So the defects. Well, I was wondering just quick on that question. So
yeah, go on that, yeah.
It's not necessarily the fact that the universe has no meaning makes it defective. It's the fact that the way it seems to have come about and what it's now acting in this way, when we see suffering, is suffering the element that we see as being defective. I'm just wondering if there will be others out there who might see meaning within suffering.
No, good point. Yeah, I guess I sort of diverge from the meaninglessness theme there, but I do think that the meaninglessness of the universe does make it defective. I mean, if from the sort of nihilism that I have in mind, it would be better for the universe to have meaning, then yeah, that's one of the defects of the universe.
So go on, Louie, I'll let you go. You go.
Well, I was just going to say, because I'm reminded of our discussion over Clarence Darrow, for example, when he's debating, is life worth living? And so I ask you then, John, that in the famous debate, Clarence is arguing that it isn't worth living, though he's not advocating killing himself. I mean, are you with Darrow in that regards?
Well, I mean, I think trying to come to conclusions about what people should or shouldn't do under these circumstances is another attempt to, posit some sort of objective truth onto the universe. This is that you should all kill yourselves. That's almost as to say that I've discovered what the true meaning of all of this plays out as. I think that, quite the contrary, there's a lot of different conclusions you can come to. In fact, an infinite number of conclusions you can come to about how you should be in the universe, because there is no particular way that anyone has to be. I think taking that, maybe this is the existentialist part of me, but taking that responsibility upon one's shoulders, that's the best you can do. Embrace your way of being in the universe. I mean, I've always loved Nietzsche. And that's certainly one of the lessons I've learned from him, is you have to embrace your truth. If you're going to embrace any truth at all, it has to be your truth, and it's not a truth that you can tell others that they need to embrace, independent of you.
And that's why I think for us, Louie, I'm just seeing you check with me on this one. So given we're calling this podcast the Existential File, so it's this existential question is something we are very much returning to. And that's where because I completely agree with that, no matter whether you see yourself as a nihilist or not, there's still that sense of we all face the question with our own experience of how we go about living our lives, whether we want to choose to see meaning or not, how we act in respect of that. And that's why, to me, completely agree that in the end, that's what it comes down to. that you're faced with the experience of living. Your choice to continue living it in a certain way or not is down to you, and that is the fundamental existential question. And what we often then ponder is that I may ask Louie. So given that, then, is there a preferred way of living? And you may say, well, it's up to you to decide that. That's it. The preferred way is your own choice, is what you choose to do. And that's why I definitely have more openness to existentialism, or an existential set of questions, whereas the nihilist one, to me, if it has this basic starting point of that it is known that there is no meaning, and whilst again Louie and I have discussions over whether or not there is or not, and I can see absolutely take the perspective that we discussed at different times about how evolution can explain and all this idea. And there's no good theory explanation of why the universe exists as opposed to not existing. Louis' usual sort of retort is, "Oh, it's a natural object." To me, doesn't help explain why it is. And therefore, given that it is, we are faced with, as humans, as beings, this decision of what we do with it, what we do with the experience. So to me, existential questions, absolutely. The nihilist one is this assumption that there is no meaning. How about there is no meaning we've yet discovered? And there's obviously plenty of people in this world who believe there is some kind of meaning to this. So I'm just kind of putting out more questions. I'm not necessarily wanting to kind of argue these things. Just say, help me then, as someone who isn't labeling himself as a nihilist. You know, how do I move forward with this? Do we have any advice or guidance of how we deal with the existential questions? The laughing one, I completely and utterly get, and that's something that Louie and I share, that just bringing this sense of humor to our daily life is the very least we could and should do. And I'm always facing this question of, and how else could I live this life, meaningless though it is, to the fullest way possible?
Yeah, well,
I'm throwing that one out to you.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be someone who would say that everyone should walk around happy all the time and laughing at everything all of the time. I wouldn't certainly advocate that, because that covers over part of the truth of reality, which is there are awful, terrible things that it's appropriate to cry about and to be distressed about in life. I think the perspective that I embrace is one that's, it recognizes the multifaceted nature of being a human in the world, and that multifaceted nature includes laughing at certain things, finding things funny. It also includes being depressed about things, and paying the awful aspects of reality their due as well. I guess it's a well-rounded, I would call it a realistic view of the world that I would advocate. In terms of the nihilistic element here, I think there's a lot of different types of nihilism. So the type of nihilism which claims that the world is meaningless, I see as one variant of this kind of nihilistic incongruity. I guess you would call it, I think you would call that an existential nihilism, perhaps. But there are things like epistemological nihilism, moral nihilism, ontological nihilism, all of these various types of nihilism, which I think are distinguished by the types of ideals that there's an incongruity between. So, for instance, in existential nihilism, you've got the recognition of an incongruity between, say, the way that human life, you wish human life was, or that life had meaning and there isn't meaning. Whereas in ontological nihilism, there's a fundamental recognition of a distinction between human being and being as such. Or, in epistemological nihilism, a distinction, an incongruity between, the desire for truth and the realization that we're living with less than the absolute truth. So I think that, if your concern about nihilism is focused on, the meaninglessness of the universe, that's one type of nihilism. And I see that as sort of like the initial assumption that the nihilist takes. So, everyone has to begin from some sort of assumption about the universe. And there may be those who don't accept, an existential nihilist assumption. They accept some other, sort of assumption, or they may not accept an epistemological nihilist assumption. But I don't, I think that, there are just an infinite number of ways that any of those assumptions can be built upon in order to, live your life in, in the way that you choose. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. And again, the question I was thinking then, as you talk about and remind us of these different types of nihilism, would it make any sense for someone just to simply describe themselves as a nihilist, or would one have to say, okay, well, what type? What are you nihilistic about? Does that make sense? Could one just say, well, I'm a nihilist and all of these things?
I think that that's exactly right. I mean, I think there can, you can be we talked about earlier, you can be a religious nihilist, recognizing that, the fallenness from God, or a liberal nihilist, that you want, you value the ideal of, equality, but don't think the world is fully equal. So I think nihilism can, can be, it can rear its head in all of those different ways. And those aren't all necessarily negative. I mean, I think one of the positive aspects of nihilism that has really, really gone unrecognized by probably most people who have written about nihilism or who have talked about nihilism is that it opens up space for something to happen. I mean, without that gap between the ideal and the real, I mean, we'd either, we'd be like communing with the ultimate and, just basking in our glory, or we wouldn't be aspiring towards anything, And I think that that nihilistic incongruities of these various kinds, that's what their power is that they open up a space where stuff happens, where people, even though they're suffering for something. They're trying to move in some direction, and ultimately it's all meaningless. And I agree with Louie in this. Ultimately, it doesn't make a big difference what it is you're aspiring towards or what you're trying to do. But there is something, I guess I would use the term noble, about doing something, making a podcast, writing a book, whatever.
And this reminds me a little bit of Camus', the myth of Sisyphus. I mean, I remember reading that, and I think would you say that you agree with Camus there, John?
Yeah, and I mean, in the myth of Sisyphus, as well as in The Rebel, he talks in similar sorts of terms about how what's absurd about the world is not that the universe is meaningless; it's that it's meaningless, and we want it to have meaning. That's the absurdity of the world.
Because in that respect, then, yeah. So if we look at animals, then, who don't have necessarily this aspiration for meaning, for them, there's no sense of it being lacking the meaning they may aspire to.
Yeah, my dog is not a nihilist. My dog doesn't care. All my dog wants to do is, go to the bathroom.
Lick his testicles.
Yeah, well, he doesn't have those anymore.
If only you could lick them.
Maybe he
aspires to that. Maybe he aspires to lick his
dog. We're middle-aged men who have lost our balls.
but maybe he aspires to that. Maybe that's something he aspires to.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe that's what he aspires to. Maybe it's a noble cause to be able to aspire to lick his testicles.
Well, and that would be another aspect of nihilism too, because that's a hopeless aspiration.
Yes.
I mean, in some ways, I know we're joking, but in some ways, I mean, animals aren't existential creatures. I mean, this is one of the things that Matthew and I have been discussing a little bit recently. I mean, my cats have no clue about the universe. You know what I mean? And again, so I don't think it really makes any sense to ask whether an animal is an existential creature. It isn't. It doesn't understand anything. And in that ways, we are different from animals, aren't we?
I think so. I mean, I think there are arguments contrary to that. Heidegger said or wrote that animals don't die, that they expire precisely for this reason, because they don't have worlds, they don't have ideals that they're aspiring to. And if that's the case, then yeah, you wouldn't have, animals that are not, they don't find themselves in an existential predicament. However, I mean, there are arguments to be made for, higher animals, maybe like elephants, having worlds that they inhabit spiritually. Apparently, elephants, they caress the bones of the dead. They seem to mourn the dead. And if that's the case, then perhaps there's more going on there than we normally recognize. Maybe we're more like elephants than we think, or chimpanzees, or dolphins, or something of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, this is my skeptical voice. We
have knees, don't we? We all have knees. So maybe that's it. Maybe if you've got knees, you're an existential creature. There you go, Louie. I've sold it for you. There you go.
Anthropomorphism aside, I do think that we look at animals and we project our own humanity into them. Again, I mean, I'm personally, and I love animals. I've got a pet tortoise and cats and things like that. But when I interrogate them, I really don't generally see very much that I would consider to be an existential experience inside them.
I tend to agree with you.
But then I feel the same about small children too. So that a 1-year-old, I see a 1-year-old and I don't see anything. Again, it takes time I think from my perspective to become an existential being. And I don't think you see people cooing, "Oh, Disney, oh, isn't he amazing?" And I'm like, no, there's nothing there at all. You're just projecting onto it what you want to see. And in some ways, I mean, before we started the podcast, John and I mentioned The Emperor's New Clothes, and I do think that in relation to other. You look out into the universe, or you look out onto babies, or you look out onto elephants, and a lot of this is the Emperor's New Clothes, and I think it does help to stop and say, well, actually, I'm not here to say that your shit doesn't stink. I mean, that's how I feel about things, which is what, everything is pointless is about, is to say, you may think that everything you're doing is full of point, but, that's your opinion. And if you're looking for some kind of objective, measure, you're not going to really find it.
So coming back to things like seeing oneself as night, or this because the seeing oneself thing has an element to it. But I'm coming back to this idea of consciousness then, because Louie and I, we've had discussions about consciousness with other guests. So John, would you feel as though, in order, of course, to be nihilistic, of course, or the defective thing about the universe is the fact that we have consciousness. That's the evolution of it. Anything that's not conscious isn't going to be faced with these kinds of sense of aspirations, the potential of meaning that isn't actually there, and so on. It's because we're conscious beings.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way of putting it. It's it's like Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer claims that humans are part of nature. We're continuous with rocks and minerals and gravity and such. What makes us suffer more than anything else in the universe is the fact that we're conscious of our existence. It's consciousness that makes us stand out of ourselves in order to reflect back on ourselves and to be dissatisfied with ourselves. I know there's a lot of talk about how wonderful it is to live in the moment, and that there's you shouldn't be anxious about the future. It's impossible, in my view, for human beings not to be anxious about the future or to think about the past. And it's that time element that's a part of consciousness, where we're not living just in this moment, like I presume an animal to be, which is reacting to instincts or reacting to urges. Human beings are incapable of doing that precisely because they're conscious beings, and that's it's a curse as well as maybe our most wonderful quality.
And this is where I want to go back to maybe both of you, but Lou, I know you've probably able to remind me of in terms of where in human evolution, even in the context of human evolution or beings that would have led to human being, we're talking relatively recently then of evolution of things like, we often linked it, the role of development of language, those kinds of things. So it's only relatively recently we've got this something emerging that now creates this sense of distress about, hold on a minute, we're now having this experience that we're calling consciousness, we're calling self, we're calling whatever we want to call it, and it's that's now creating this sense of distress about the universe, because we're starting to reflect on, well, what's it all about?
I mean, for me, it's the first pieces of evidence which suggest, humans are existential beings are the cave paintings, and the handprints and the pictures of the animals on the hunt. And those people stood in the caves and they told stories of the hunt and they cried for the people that had died. And I think they're the first, they're the first existential beings. And our genetic ancestors before those people just sat around in circles making the same acts over and over again, which is as far removed from human beings as I think you can be. I don't know.
And it may be, like you said earlier, that there is a developmental continuum even with, quote unquote human creatures. I mean, maybe there's, a particular point in, development of any individual where they become conscious or they become human. Perhaps before that point, they are more like animals or non-reflective beings.
Which is exactly what I think about, I think that, again, as a psychologist, and Matthew and I are obviously coming at it from psychologists, I mean, infant amnesia ends at 3, and I think before that there's something different going on, and most people would consider their 3-year-old or 2-year-old to be conscious, but I think actually, again, I don't see it. But
yeah, maybe, but that's an empirical question. It's I guess that diverges away from the the sort of philosophical assumptions that we bring to the conversation. I mean, those are issues that can be empirically studied or established potentially.
Sure. Whereas, red dots on noses, I think they use, don't they?
Yeah, it did for like chimpanzees and such.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's something there that, 'cause I think there's several things there. One is evolution of language, both in terms of species and in an individual. There's something about becoming that self-aware. So this idea of the red knot, is that right? Noticing that so this is what you're talking about, Louie, the kind of image in the mirror and the reflection.
Yeah.
And then I'm wondering, is there something else? The existential question, though, is that about whether there's this sense of one's own mortality? And is that when that becomes slightly later in the point, saying, hold a minute, if we're thinking about this, reflecting on this, not only can we reflect on ourselves, as in the way this idea of the reflection, that the nose, the dot on the nose is a reflection of ourselves, but maybe there's something more about the existential element comes with, oh, I exist for a period of time in this universe, and then there'll be a point at which I won't exist. Is that where more of the existential being?
Well, I mean, for me, they go hand in hand. And I wrote a blog piece recently. I said I wouldn't be surprised if Neanderthals were existential beings. I mean, they buried their dead. They put flowers in the grave. That suggests to me that they are, at the very least, sad that that person is gone. I would say it goes hand in hand.
I think the very moment that one steps outside of themselves, and whatever the exterior evidence for this is, but the very moment that one thinks in terms of a future or a past, I think that the question of mortality comes up, because when one reflects upon the past, you recognize that you weren't always here. And so that leads the mind to reflect on the future and the speculation that, well, perhaps in the future, I won't be here again. So I think, yeah, I agree with Louie that I think that the whole existential issue is bound up with, this awareness of finality and with mortality, with death.
And I wonder if, John, because you're the philosopher in the room, but, I get the feeling that the further we get away from death, and especially modern, for us in modern times, 21st century, our children aren't dying, we aren't losing 9 children, and our parents aren't, in boxes in our house, and we're getting further removed. And in fact, you go back in the past, and philosophers, they did lose their children. They did have their parents dead in a box in their house. People went to war. And I do think that somehow that informed them in ways that we've almost losing. Would you agree with that? Or
I absolutely agree. I think that it becomes easier and easier the more civilized we become to forget those types of awful realities about the world. We don't, the suffering and death are not in our face as much, or as everyday realities, and so it's easier to forget about it. It makes me think of the book and the movie Fight Club, and the metaphor of soap that's used in that story. You know, soap, according to the main character in Fight Club, was first discovered when women were washing their clothes in a river downstream from where sacrificial fires were burned. And so they realized that their clothes were getting cleaner because of the fat that was leaching through the lye from the fires into the river. And so cleanliness and death were really, really closely associated, according to, you know, the character in Fight Club in ancient times. But today, now we package our soap in, you know, these nice, tidy little packages and completely forget about the origin of, you know, of soap. So it's like this perfect metaphor, you know, wherein death and decay and all of that is, you know, is part of, you know, part of civilization. But we, you know, we've forgotten that.
I was going to say, is there a connection there between the Holocaust and soap? I mean, is that, I can't remember. I have seen Fight Club. I don't remember if that's, because that's obviously a horrific event of the 20th century.
Yeah, like you think human fat. I think the, you know, fat is what one of the ingredients that's used in soap. And yeah, I do think that the Nazis used human soap or human fat to make soap.
With John's comment about, you know, finality, mortality, and death, that for me brought us a nice round, you know, ending to this particular episode. But I did want to point out, I'm sure somewhere in what John was describing, he effectively described this podcast and this podcast alone as noble. It was in there somewhere. They maybe talk about podcasts in general, but I think he meant this one particularly.
I'm not sure that's entirely true.
Well, that's what I was hearing from it. So I think on that note, as we have those words in our ears echoing with this podcast being a noble enterprise, let's thank John and thank you for your input. I really enjoyed that. I've got so many ideas now about nihilism I can quiz Louie on until he gets sick of hearing the questions. So thank you for that, and hopefully we'll speak again very soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.